When Kellen and I got married, we didn't have much. We rented a small apartment with old carpet, secondhand furniture, and a kitchen so tiny that only one of us could stand in it at a time. Even then, we believed those hard years were only temporary. We would laugh over cheap dinners and remind each other that every sacrifice was bringing us closer to the life we wanted. When Kellen was accepted into medical school, we celebrated like we had already won. I truly believed his dream was our dream. Without hesitation, I took on the responsibility of paying the bills. I picked up extra shifts, skipped vacations, and put every spare dollar toward tuition, books, rent, and groceries. Some weeks I barely had enough energy to make it through the day. But hearing Kellen tell me how grateful he was made it feel worthwhile, that he always promised that once he finished his training, everything would change for both of us. He would tell me, "One day I'll take care of you the way you've taken care of me." Those words stayed with me during every long shift and every sleepless night. They gave me hope when life felt overwhelming. Years passed faster than I expected. His classes turned into clinical rotations, and those became residency. Finally, the day arrived when he accepted his first job as an attending physician. I stood beside him feeling proud, almost as if I had crossed the finish line too, that I thought the hardest part of our journey was finally over. I believed we could slow down, spend time together again, and start living instead of just surviving. But almost immediately, I noticed little changes that were impossible to ignore, even though I kept trying to convince myself they meant nothing. At first, the changes were so small that I almost felt guilty for noticing them. Kellen started coming home later than usual, even on days when he had told me he wasn't on call. If I asked how his day went, his answers became short and ended the conversation before it could really begin. The long talks we used to have over dinner slowly disappeared. He also stopped sharing the little details of his life. Before, he would tell me about new coworkers, difficult patients, or funny moments at the hospital. Now he simply said he was tired and went straight to his office or fell asleep on the couch. It felt like there was a wall growing between us. Money also became strangely private. We had always planned everything together, but suddenly he wanted to handle certain accounts by himself. When I asked simple questions about our finances, he would sigh and say I didn't need to worry about it anymore. That answer never made me feel safe. It made me feel pushed aside. Whenever I tried to explain how distant he seemed, he acted like I was creating problems that didn't exist. He told me I was overthinking everything and said the pressure of being a new doctor was exhausting him. After hearing that enough times, I started questioning my own feelings. Maybe I really was expecting too much. Still, something inside me refused to settle down. I couldn't explain it with facts, but I could feel it every time we sat in the same room without speaking. The house hadn't changed, but it no longer felt like the home we had built together. It felt like I was living beside someone who was slowly closing the door on me. Not long after that, we started spending more time with Kellen's parents because they wanted to celebrate his new career. I hoped being around family would help us feel close again, but every visit left me feeling smaller. Almost every conversation was about Kellen's hard work, his talent, and the bright future waiting for him. No one ever mentioned the years it had taken for us to reach that moment together. Whenever someone praised him, Vaughn would proudly say his son had earned every bit of his success on his own. Corinne smiled and agreed, saying she always knew he was meant for something bigger. I would sit there quietly, wondering if anyone remembered the years I spent keeping our lives together while he chased that dream. One evening during dinner, Corinne laughed and said Kellen had outgrown the little life we used to live. Everyone at the table smiled except me. I forced a smile because I didn't want to create an uncomfortable moment, but her words stayed with me long after we went home. Later that night, I walked into the hallway looking for my purse and heard Corinne speaking softly with Kellen in another room. She told him it was time to think about the next chapter of his life now that he had finally made it. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough to know they were talking about the future without mentioning me once. As we drove home, I waited for Kellen to explain what I had heard. Instead, he acted like nothing had happened, and the silence between us felt heavier than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that decisions were already being made behind my back. A few days later, Kellen told me there was a special dinner to celebrate his new partnership at the medical practice. I thought it would be a chance for us to enjoy everything we had worked toward together. I dressed nicely and walked into the event feeling proud of him, hoping the difficult weeks between us would finally be behind us. The room was full of doctors, business partners, and their families. Kellen spent most of the evening talking with different groups while I stayed close, waiting for him to introduce me. When he finally did, my heart sank. Instead of saying I was his wife, he smiled and called me someone who had been supportive over the years. It sounded like I was just an old friend who had helped him once. The people around us smiled politely and moved on to the next conversation. I stood there trying not to show how much those few words had hurt me. Kellen acted as if nothing was wrong and continued enjoying the evening. Later, I stepped outside for some fresh air and accidentally heard Kellen talking with two other doctors near the parking area. They were discussing job opportunities in another city and looking at expensive neighborhoods where they wanted to buy homes. Kellen spoke about the move as if it was already part of his future. Not once did he mention me or ask how I would fit into those plans. The drive home was painfully quiet. I stared out the window, replaying every moment of that night in my mind. For the first time, I stopped wondering if I was imagining things. It finally felt like I was watching my own marriage from the outside, and everyone seemed to know where it was headed except me. After that night, I stopped trying to convince myself that everything would work out on its own. I needed answers instead of excuses. Since I had always helped organize our household paperwork, I began looking through the financial records we still kept at home. I wasn't trying to invade his privacy. I was trying to understand what was happening to my marriage. What I found left me completely stunned. There were statements for bank accounts I had never seen before. They had been opened months earlier without a single conversation with me. I also noticed that part of his salary was no longer going into the accounts we had always shared. The money had been moved somewhere else. Little by little, I kept sorting through the documents. I found paperwork that showed he had met with a divorce attorney. The date on those papers hit me the hardest. He had started preparing long before I realized anything was wrong. During that same time, he had smiled at me, thanked me for supporting him, and acted like we were still building a future together. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the papers spread out in front of me. Every late shift I had worked and every sacrifice I had made came rushing back into my mind. It wasn't only that he wanted to leave. It was knowing he had been quietly planning it while allowing me to keep believing in promises that no longer meant anything to him. That was the moment I understood this wasn't a sudden decision. It had been carefully planned, and I had never been meant to see it coming until everything was already in place. I didn't wait for him to bring it up anymore. That evening, I placed the papers on the table and asked him to tell me the truth. He looked at them for a few seconds without saying anything. Then he quietly sat down and admitted that he wanted a divorce. There was no apology, no regret, and no sign that this conversation was difficult for him. He said we had simply become different people over the years. According to him, our marriage had run its course, and ending it was the best choice for both of us. He spoke so calmly that it sounded like he was discussing a business decision instead of ending the life we had built together. When I reminded him of everything we had gone through, he shrugged. He said supporting each other was part of marriage, and that I shouldn't expect anything in return. Hearing those words hurt more than I can describe. It was as if every sacrifice I had made had suddenly become invisible. I asked him if he truly believed he could have reached this point without my help. He avoided my eyes and said his career was the result of his own hard work. In that moment, I realized he had rewritten our entire history in his mind. The years we struggled together no longer mattered to him. I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. I wasn't crying because the marriage was ending. I was crying because the man I had trusted most had erased me from the story of his success. As I sat there in silence, I honestly felt like everything I had worked for had disappeared, and I had no idea how I was supposed to begin again. For several days, I let myself feel the pain instead of fighting it. I cried, barely slept, and kept asking myself how everything had fallen apart so completely. But after a while, I realized that staying stuck in my sadness would not change what had happened. If Kellen had already planned his future, then I needed to start protecting mine. I scheduled a meeting with a family law attorney who listened carefully without interrupting me. Instead of making promises, she asked for facts and documents. She explained that emotions alone would not help my case, but clear records could make a real difference. When I left her office, I finally felt like I had a direction. Over the next few weeks, I gathered every document I could find. I collected tuition bills, loan records, tax returns, bank statements, and receipts that showed where our money had gone over the years. I even found old calendars and work schedules that showed how many extra shifts I had taken while Kellen focused on school and training. Looking through those papers was painful because every page reminded me of another dream I had put on hold. Still, each document also reminded me that my contribution was real. No one could honestly say I had done nothing. Slowly, my thinking began to change. I stopped wondering whether Kellen would suddenly realize what he had done. That hope was gone. My goal was no longer to change his mind or save the marriage. I wanted the truth to be recognized. I wasn't trying to punish him for leaving. I simply refused to let him walk away, pretending he had built his successful life without everything I had given to help him get there. The first settlement meeting was nothing like Kellen expected. He arrived looking calm and confident, almost as if everything had already been decided. His attorney handed over an offer that would have left me with very little. It was clear they believed I would accept it just to end the process and move on with my life. My attorney didn't react right away. She calmly placed our documents on the table and began explaining them one by one. She showed records of the tuition payments, living expenses, loan contributions, and years of financial support that allowed Kellen to complete his education without carrying the full burden himself. Every document matched a date and a payment. There was no room for doubt. As the meeting continued, Kellen's expression slowly changed. The confidence he walked in with began to disappear. For the first time, he couldn't simply dismiss everything I had done because the proof was sitting in front of everyone. A few days later, his parents also realized the situation was not going the way they had expected. They had believed I would quietly step aside while Kellen started his new life. Instead, they were forced to see that the choices he had made during our marriage had real legal and financial consequences. I stayed calm through the entire process. I didn't argue or raise my voice because the evidence spoke for itself. Watching their plan begin to fall apart gave me a quiet sense of strength. They had spent months believing I had no way to stand up for myself. Now they understood that I had something much stronger than anger. I had the truth, and it was finally being heard. The day of the final hearing, I walked into the courtroom feeling nervous, but I also felt ready. I had spent weeks preparing with my attorney, and I knew we had done everything we could. This was no longer about saving a marriage. It was about making sure the truth could not be ignored. During the hearing, Kellen tried to make it sound as though I had only done what any husband or wife would do. He said his career was built because of his own effort and long hours. But each time he tried to reduce my role, my attorney presented another document that proved how much I had contributed over the years. The facts spoke more clearly than either of us could. The judge listened carefully as the records were explained. My years of financial support, the payments I had made, and the sacrifices I had accepted were all placed into the record. There was nothing exaggerated or emotional about the evidence. It simply showed the truth. Kellen's parents were sitting quietly behind him. They had defended him from the beginning, but now they had nothing to say. They watched as the story they believed slowly fell apart in front of them. When I was given the chance to speak, I stayed calm. I said I was not asking anyone to force Kellen to stay married to me. I accepted that he wanted to leave. What I could not accept was having my years of love, work, and sacrifice erased as though they had never mattered. For the first time in a long while, I felt heard, and that feeling alone helped me stand a little taller. When the judge announced the final decision, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The settlement recognized the years I had spent supporting Kellen's education and career. It did not erase the pain of everything that had happened, but it gave me the chance to move forward without feeling that my sacrifices had been completely ignored. After everything was finished, I no longer had any reason to look back. I focused on rebuilding my own life one step at a time. I applied to the graduate program I had once dreamed of attending, but had put aside for so many years. This time, I was choosing myself without feeling guilty about it. Life became quieter, and that peace was something I had not felt in a long time. I started making plans based on what I wanted instead of what someone else needed from me. Every small achievement reminded me that it was never too late to begin again. I later heard that Kellen's relationships with some of his family members had become strained. The court's decision and everything that came out during the case had changed the way people looked at what had happened. I didn't celebrate that because it wasn't what I had been fighting for. The biggest lesson I learned had nothing to do with money. It was about knowing my own value, even when someone I loved tried to make me believe I had none. I finally understood that real love should never require one person to disappear, so the other can succeed. My marriage ended, but I walked away with something much more important. I kept my self-respect, found my own path again, and stepped into a future that truly belonged to me.